Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. It's good to be back after a brief hiatus. Well, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has invited his Indian counterpart, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for the G7 summit as he confirmed details on Sunday for the high-level meeting to be presided over by Britain in the coastal region of Cornwall between June 11th and 13th. Johnson had extended an invitation to Prime Minister Modi during a phone call last year, and India was chosen alongside South Korea and Australia as guest countries of the multilateral summit. The invitation was made formal on Sunday. Johnson also reiterated his plan to visit India ahead of the G7 summit after a scheduled visit for Republic Day this month was called off due to the ongoing coronavirus crisis. The Group of Seven, or G7, which is made up of the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and the United States, is dubbed as an open forum where the world's most influential and open societies are brought together for close-knit discussions, with the pandemic likely to dominate this year's talks. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze G7 and India. Joining me on the program today are Jitendra Nath Mishra, former ambassador, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, and Sriram Chaulia, foreign affairs expert. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. Of course, the invitation was made a few weeks ago, but now it has been made formal by the Prime Minister of Britain, that is Boris Johnson. What do you make of this development?
Well, it's an important development, and it's a continuous process, actually. Remember that President Trump had invited India, South Korea, Australia, and Russia also for the summit that wasn't held last year in the year 2020. So it's 3 countries out of 4. And India is, of course, very important for various reasons. The first reason, the most pressing reason, is obviously the COVID crisis. And Britain is reeling from the crisis. It's had 88,000 deaths, the highest numbers in Europe from this crisis. And of course, we have a very tangible, productive, and the numbers are very good. We have the AstraZeneca vaccine being manufactured by the Serum Institute of India, and the Covishield vaccine. And this is a result of very friendly cooperation. And India will be able to supply this to the rest of the world, to Britain and other countries at affordable rates also. And this is a win-win situation for both the countries. And that's why Prime Minister Johnson had said that recovery post-COVID will be one of the major agenda items in the forthcoming G7 summit in the summer. Isn't it wonderful to know that the formula, the technology is British, the manufacturing is Indian, and the users are global? So this is really a manifestation of soft power, Britain's soft power, India's soft power, win-win situation. Then there is, of course, Britain's what is called the tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. Now, what has happened after Britain left the European Union, and after the European Union has had its own investment agreement with China recently, despite US displeasure, what has happened? So Britain doesn't want to be left out on both counts. It's neither in the European Union, nor is it pivoting to the Indo-Pacific. So it makes very good sense strategically to pivot towards a country like India, and therefore India has been invited. And the third issue is, of course, the so-called group of democracies, the G10. There was also a report, as you know, that the G7 should become the D10. And with India, South Korea, and Australia. Now, will it become the D10? That's a challenging issue, I think, and the jury is still out. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but the intention is there. The idea is to create a concert of democracies, and the unwritten thing in this is China. China right. as a bulwark against China. That's the unwritten part of the script. Whether it will happen or not is something that we have to wait and see, because there are many countries that are willing to stand up to China who may not be formally democracies like India or the United Kingdom. and what happens to them. At the same time, the share of the G7 in the world's GDP has precipitously declined to 40% with the rise of Asia, China
Right.
and India, and others. So you want more partners in this. You want to create a D10, more important countries with greater heft to increase the GNP share of the now the G7 evolving into a D10 in the world's GDP share.
All right. I'll come to D10 in just a bit. But before that, Sriram Chaulia, let's talk about G7 itself. Significance of the G7. What is it that it brings to the table? What can India's role be? What does all of this mean for India?
Yeah, Frank, G7 was a group of rich, industrialized capitalist countries to begin with in the 1970s. And it was actually meant to be a coordination forum to counter communism and communist ideas in those days. Now, lately, what has happened is, as Ambassador was saying, their economic growth has slowed, while emerging powers, including BRICS countries, especially China, but others, have also risen parallel to this relative decline of the rich countries. So G7 ultimately, in a way, there was an expansion of sorts. Although G7 remained as a separate grouping of these rich countries, we got the G20, right? That's now in its second decade in existence now. So we have been saying in India for a long time that the G7 was not representative enough of the changed global economic and military and power realities. So to that extent, the G7 has indeed declined in importance. But I think given these special characteristic of being a club of democracies, and also the fact that the US is still there in it, and even though Trump was never an enthusiastic participant in it, with the change in administration in Washington and Biden coming in, I think they will look to lift the relevance and the heft of G7, as well as other multilateral bodies, even G20. So I think when we talk of club of democracies or simply reinvigorating G7, for Britain, for obvious reasons, after Brexit, they need the so-called global Britain. They need to show leadership. So as the host countries of G7 have a prerogative to invite special countries other than the permanent members. So that's where, for example, France, Biarritz invited Prime Minister Modi in 2019 as well. And the US was going to invite us in 2020 as well, had it happened. So to that extent, it shows that this grouping may still have some value, especially with regard to confrontation with China and the ideological differences. They're talking about technology. That's one key area where they need consensus. There are some European countries that are members of G7, but which have gone in favor of investment agreement with China recently. So Britain, after Brexit, is looking more towards the US and to align closer to the US agenda. And the Europeans are the big iffy group in the middle. You have Italy, France, Germany. I mean, they need to have clarity on this. Can we have alternative to Huawei for 5G, for example? Can we have alternative to the Chinese debt trap in the form of financing mechanisms, for example? Climate change, again, this is an area where the Europeans think of themselves as leaders, but can we all come together and form alternative to the Chinese coal-based economic growth model, which they are now exporting worldwide? So I think there is now of a basis for a rebirth of G7, and I think involving India, Australia, South Korea shows that Pacific dimension, the Indo-Pacific dimension also, because ultimately the Western countries, there was only Japan in it as a permanent member. There's no other Asian country in it. So to bring in more Asian countries from the Indo-Pacific is a good idea. It's a sign that the Indo-Pacific momentum will also build up as a result.
Absolutely. All right. So, Pramit, let's dwell upon this idea of the D10 for just a bit. Do you see the G7 expanding to become the D10, a formalization of that particular grouping taking place sometime in the near future? What's the idea there?
Well, right now, I think Britain and America are definitely moving towards the idea that you need to incorporate definitely South Korea, India, and Australia, and maybe Brazil. into such a form, into the G7. And as others have mentioned, President Trump, in his abortive attempt to hold a G7 summit, clearly put something like that, where he wanted the G7 plus the 3 other countries from the Quad brought in into the G7. The D10 is roughly a similar formation. Some other proposals have included having Vietnam, for example, into this as well, though it's not really a democracy. What's happening here effectively is, as some of the others have mentioned, is that the original G7 was expanded to, should we say, replaced or complemented with the G20 for economic reasons, that the response to the global financial crisis required a larger group of countries beyond the G7, and notably it had to include China and emerging economies like India and Brazil. Today, we now have a geopolitical problem entering the field, which, as has been mentioned, is China. How do you respond to China? And there is no consensus even among the developed world, even the Western world, as to how to respond. So I would argue Britain and America have taken the hardest line on China. You can see their policies on 5G are more or less in line. They've been banning, both countries have more or less banned Huawei, ZTE, for example. The British are trying to position themselves as an Indo-Pacific power, and whether it's positioning an aircraft carrier or joining the CPTPP, the new version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, both of these are effectively aimed at China. So you have within the G7, these 2 countries are furthest ahead in their view of responding to create or reshape things like the G7 into counters to China. However, there is no consensus within the G7. Germany and Italy, we know, were very unhappy at the idea of the D10 because they feared, not incorrectly, that China would perceive this as an anti-China move. Even France was a little worried that this would be a problem. So we'll see whether the other G7, all the G7 members would have to agree to an expansion of D10. I don't think that consensus exists, and I think Germany in particular, which has been extremely reluctant to cross swords with China for economic reasons, will go along with this. Italy almost certainly not. So this is the first round of, I think, of a series of struggles or debates within the G7 to see whether or not they would permanently expand it to be a D10.
Absolutely. All right. So taking the discussion forward, I'm going to ask my panelists to be brief so that we can have closing comments at the end of the program as well. Ambassador, would you say that this is a continuation of our COVID-19 diplomacy?
Oh, absolutely. Very much a continuation of a COVID-19 diplomacy. And I think this has been one of the great successes of our government in the past 1 year. Crisis becomes opportunity in that sense. And isn't it wonderful that we have been able to develop our own vaccine, our own technology, our own formula, so to say. We are not just manufacturing it, but we are also manufacturing the know-how of the vaccine, Covaxin, and Covishield, the AstraZeneca vaccine. So we are a manufacturer and we are an innovator at the same time. And this is tremendous. And I think this is a very important reason and which gives urgency to the invitation that has been extended to India, at least, between Britain and India. And there is a lot of a bilateral element in it, because this adds great value to our relationship, even bilaterally, going beyond the domain of the G7 or the D10. So what we are going to do now is, after we start our vaccination within our own country, since you asked this question, the next priority will be our neighbors. And of course, Nepal has expressly desired, and we should be very happy and satisfied that our capability in this is ahead of China's. And that's why Nepal, which does a policy of equidistance between China and India on most strategic issues, has made a choice in favor of the Indian vaccine. Bangladesh, Maldives, all our neighbors, and then, of course, the extended neighborhood. And India's great forte in this has been, as you know, affordability and accessibility to countries that are relatively poor, and that's why we are the #1 generic drugs manufacturer in the world, 40% of the US market, no less. And you know what happened with the generic AIDS drugs, the cocktails of drugs for AIDS. So the same kind of thing is going to happen with India. And I'm very happy that India's COVID diplomacy is succeeding, and we are a part of the so-called V5 club now, the Vaccine 5, which is the 5 countries who have either their own technology or manufacturing capability, or both: the US, the UK, Russia, China, and India. And that, I think, is a great step forward for Atmanirbhar Bharat and Indian manufacturing.
Absolutely. Shriram Chaulia, so what does this mean for the bilateral relationship between India and the UK?
Yeah, Frank, there has been a lot of talk about how allegedly India's image has suffered in the Western world. I mean, there's been this whole narrative spread by anti-India elements both within our country and abroad, saying that somehow, due to some issues relating to minorities and intolerance and all that, India's stature has fallen in the international public opinion and international arena. That is totally false. Why are we being invited repeatedly to these most important forums? Why did we get 184 out of 192 votes in the UN General Assembly to get elected, to get a non-permanent seat in the Security Council? So I think these are indicators that Britain definitely, and the Western world as a whole, still holds India in very high regard. We should not fall for some, ideologically biased media houses that are spreading this tendency that somehow, our image is being spoiled. Actually, our image is rising, and that is an important, this is an indicator of that. And for Britain, I think they are looking increasingly to the US. One, they want a bilateral trade deal with the US, and two, they will have to come to India. And they will need a lot of support in Asia for rebuilding, because they have lost free access to the European market. Although they did a deal at the end of 2020, it's not going to ensure, especially for their service sector, free access. So they're looking at big markets, and India automatically comes up on top for them due to the colonial legacy, the Commonwealth linkage, the English language, ease with which the investors can come in and go out. And even defense, I think they've got some assets in the Indian Ocean region, and we want to do what we are doing with France, also with Britain to a lesser extent. And ultimately, I think Britain is worried about the Chinese behemoth, because the excessive Chinese penetration into the European Union, heart of the EU itself, right. The Brits were warning against it. And they were trying to, but then, the Germans, because of Volkswagen and all these things, they want access to the Chinese market, and the Germans carried the day on this investment agreement they recently did. Had Britain remained within the EU, I think it would not have been such a cakewalk for the Chinese to seal this new investment agreement with the European Union. So I think sure. Britain values India much more now, and the ideological, it's coming into sharp relief now. Authoritarianism versus free countries. The more we emphasize that, it is better for us strategically, and the better it is for us to form a coalition to manage the hegemonic rise of China.
All right. So Pramit, since we're here, then, since you're talking so much about China, at some level, do you believe that China is concerned about, all that's happening really as far as the G7 and the inclusion of India, South Korea and Australia are concerned come June? Or do you believe that this is something that the Chinese are just going to brush aside?
They're going to wait and see. They have been concerned. They've been very concerned about the Quad, which they have repeatedly denounced. They have been concerned about formulations like the D10 or the G7 plus the Quad. The Americans, especially under the Trump administration, and we'll see if it continues under the Biden administration, have repeatedly tried to use the Quad as the cornerstone of a whole set of formulations in technology and so on that they've been trying. We also have the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative by Japan, which also seems to be designed largely to isolate or reduce dependency on China. So the Chinese would be concerned, but the Chinese also recognize that words and meetings by themselves do not constitute tangible concerns. So these meetings may happen, but is anything coming out of them is what they will be looking for. If I'm a Chinese leader right now, I'm looking at the fact that the world has come out of a pandemic in which China was to blame, but nobody is actually penalizing China in any serious manner. My economy will be the fastest growing economy on the rebound in this coming year, probably well over 8% growth. My exports have been completely untouched by some very erratic attempts by President Trump to impose tariffs and so on. And a large number of countries who, whether in Africa, the Middle East, even Eastern Europe, have made it very clear that they still believe China is an absolutely essential economic and political partner. And finally, the only country that I, as a Chinese leader, are concerned about, the United States, is in chaos. So I'm actually probably, as Chinese leader, looking at the D10, but saying right now that's still just words.
Right, okay. I've got about 2 minutes left on the program. Quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, the best way forward is to take this forward in a pragmatic way rather than in an ideological or evangelical way. And that means that we don't have to go too hard on the D10 because we might be leaving out some other countries who are not formal democracies, as I already mentioned. And these could be countries in the Middle East, for example. So our interest lies in forming a broad coalition that take care of the rise of China, and because we don't have the capability to do it alone. And Britain is a partner of choice in that for its own reasons, because of Brexit and because of China's rise. It's tilting towards us. And I think there is movements of interest that will continue for the next 5 or 10 years.
All right, Sriram Chaulia.
I think G7 plus 3, whatever we want to call it, D10 or G10, we should come up with some concrete proposals for cooperative projects in the Indo-Pacific. This is now becoming very, very crucial, especially connectivity and infrastructure projects. The US had announced last year that India could also join the Blue Dot network that they already have for certification of infrastructure projects. But more than certification, we need financing. Japan is a part of G7, and they can shell out the money to some extent. But if we pool resources, create a big fund, and launch an alternative, infrastructure building alliance of sorts for development, I think it will go a long way in pushing back the creeping shadow of China all over the developing world. We need to do a lot together and come up with concrete proposals. Otherwise, talk is cheap, as they say in international relations, and the Chinese can walk away saying, no harm done.
And Pramit, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark.
We have to realize that the G7 is basically an organization in decline. So to some degree, while the D10 is a way to help revamp it, we need to be open to the idea that even within the G7, there are probably only 3 countries, maybe 4, who are actually have a geopolitical interest that is similar to ours. That's basically Britain, America, Japan, and maybe France. The others don't have, in my view at least, any sense of a global geopolitical concern regarding China. They're looking at it only in terms of making money. So we have to be conscious of that. There's no reason to be with the D10, but what we invest in as a nation has to be driven by these larger issues.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to my panelists for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. The invitation to join the G7 come June 2021 is a continuation of our COVID-19 diplomacy, is what the panelists are suggesting. And India has shown the way as far as fighting the pandemic is concerned. And democracies around the world want to ensure that they can take India's technical capabilities as far as manufacturing vaccines are concerned forward, and that's why we're seeing more countries coming closer towards India. As far as the G7+3 or the D10, whatever you want to call it, they should keep the Indo-Pacific at the center and ensure that they work on connectivity and infrastructure projects and ensure that the best comes out of that too. And let's not forget that this should not be seen as a confrontation to take on China, but like-minded countries coming together to bring out the best. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.